Phuoc Tuy Province, 1967. In the triple canopy jungle northwest of Nui Dat, 5 men are moving through the undergrowth. They are not walking, they are barely breathing. Every step is calculated. Every hand placement is deliberate. A twig snaps under American boots a kilometer away, and these men hear it. They process it. They dismiss it. But when the wind shifts and carries the faint smell of fish sauce and unwashed cloth, they freeze. They become part of the jungle. They are Australians. They are SAS. And they are hunting. 50 meters ahead, invisible in the green twilight beneath the canopy, a Viet Cong patrol is moving down a trail. 7 men, AK-47 slung casually. They are talking, they are smoking. They believe they own this jungle. They have owned it for years. They have ambushed the South Vietnamese here. They have planted mines that have killed Americans. They move with the confidence of predators in their own territory. They do not know that they are being watched. They do not know that the Australians have been shadowing them for 3 hours, moving so slowly that the patrol has covered less than 500 meters. They do not know that in the next 60 seconds their understanding of warfare is about to be shattered. The lead Australian, the scout, raises his fist. The patrol stops, not gradually, instantly, completely, like a film paused mid-frame. The second man, the patrol commander, makes a subtle hand gesture. The men spread out. They form a loose arc. They select their firing positions. They do not speak. They do not need to. They have rehearsed this 1,000 times. They are about to demonstrate what will become the most feared tactic in the Vietnam War. They are about to show the Viet Cong what happens when you underestimate the quiet men from Perth. The engagement lasts 11 seconds. It sounds like the end of the world. The jungle erupts in a storm of automatic fire. Not scattered shots, not aimed bursts. A continuous, overwhelming wave of lead that turns the trail into a kill box. The Australians are firing on full automatic, modified SLRs with 30-round magazines, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers. The volume of fire is apocalyptic. It sounds like a company. It sounds like a battalion. But it is 5 men. The Viet Cong do not return fire. They cannot. 3 are dead before they understand what is happening. 2 more fall trying to find cover that does not exist. The survivors run. They crash through the jungle in blind panic. They leave their weapons. They leave their dead. They run because they believe they are being overrun by a massive force. They are wrong. But by the time they realize it, the Australians are gone, vanished, melted back into the jungle like smoke. This is the simple trick. This is the weapon that will give the Australian SAS the highest kill ratio of the entire Vietnam War. It is not technology. It is not air support. It is not some secret piece of equipment. It is silence and violence. It is the ability to move like ghosts and strike like gods. It is the tactical doctrine of absolute stealth combined with overwhelming firepower. Move slowly, kill fast, disappear completely. The North Vietnamese will call them the phantoms of the jungle. The Viet Cong will tell stories about the Australian demons who appear from nowhere and vanish into nothing. And for 6 years, from 1966 to 1971, the men of the Special Air Service Regiment will prove that you do not need to be the biggest force on the battlefield. You just need to be the smartest. But to understand how this tactic evolved, how it became the nightmare of every communist soldier in Phuoc Tuy Province, you have to go back. You have to understand where these men came from and what made them different from every other unit fighting in Vietnam. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was not born in Vietnam. It was forged in the jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966, while American advisors were still figuring out how to operate in Southeast Asian terrain. Australian soldiers were already masters of it. They had learned their trade in Malaya during the emergency of the 1950s. They had perfected the art of jungle warfare against communist insurgents who used the same tactics, the same terrain, and the same ruthless determination as the Viet Cong. The lessons learned in those green hells were written in blood and sweat. Never use the trails. Never make noise. Never give the enemy a target. And when you strike, strike with such ferocity that the enemy believes he is facing 10 times your actual strength. The SAS was officially raised as a company in 1957, modeled directly on the British Special Air Service. They took the motto, "Who dares wins." They took the selection process, brutal and unforgiving. They took the mindset that special operations were not about superhuman soldiers, but about ordinary men, trained to do extraordinary things through discipline, preparation, and absolute mastery of their craft. By 1964, the company had expanded to a full regiment with 3 Sabre squadrons. Each squadron consisted of roughly 120 men, organized into troops of 16, further divided into 4-man patrols. These were not the largest patrols in Vietnam. American long-range reconnaissance patrols often operated with 6 or 7 men. But the Australians found that 4 was the perfect number, small enough to move silently, large enough to generate devastating firepower, tight enough that every man knew exactly what his patrol mates were thinking at any given moment. When 3 Squadron deployed to Vietnam in June 1966, they arrived with a doctrine already proven in combat. The British SAS had pioneered deep penetration patrols in World War II. The Australians had refined those techniques in Malaya and Borneo. Now they were about to apply them in an environment that seemed designed to test every principle they held sacred. The jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province were different from Borneo, thicker, hotter, more hostile. The enemy was different too. The Viet Cong were not the scattered guerrillas of Malaya. They were organized. They were experienced. They had been fighting continuously since the French Indochina War. They knew every trail, every river crossing, every ambush position. They had informants in every village. They had bunker complexes that could withstand artillery strikes. They had survived American search and destroy operations that threw entire divisions into the jungle. They were not going to be intimidated by a few Australian patrols. The Australians did not try to intimidate them. They did something far more effective. They disappeared. The first SAS patrols in Vietnam moved differently than any other unit in theater. American patrols typically covered several kilometers per day. They moved with a purpose. They wanted to make contact. They wanted to find the enemy and call in firepower. The Australian philosophy was the opposite. An SAS patrol might spend an entire day covering 500 meters, sometimes less. They did not use the trails, ever. Trails were death traps. They were mined. They were watched. They were kill zones. Instead, the Australians cut their own paths through the thickest, most miserable terrain they could find. Bamboo thickets that tore at uniforms and skin, wait-a-while vines that snagged every piece of equipment, swamps that bred leeches and disease. The logic was brutal but simple. If the terrain was horrible for them, the enemy would not expect anyone to be there. And if the enemy was not expecting you, you owned the advantage. Noise discipline was absolute. The men did not speak on patrol. Not a word, not a whisper. Communication was done through hand signals or a simple length of fishing line strung between each man. A tug on the line meant stop. 2 tugs meant enemy ahead. 3 tugs meant danger close. In the suffocating heat and humidity of the Vietnamese jungle, where the air itself felt like a wet blanket, these men moved in complete silence for days at a time. They wrapped their equipment in cloth to prevent metal from clanking. They taped down anything that might rattle. They moved during specific hours when enemy activity was predictable, usually between 1100 and 1500 hours, what they called Phuoc time, when the Viet Cong typically rested during the heat of the day. During these hours, the Australians would find a concealed position, fan out in a loose perimeter, and conduct what they called sensory reconnaissance. They would watch, they would listen, they would smell the air for cooking fires or the distinctive odor of a large group of men. They would gather intelligence without ever being seen. At night, the patrols would establish a logger position. This was not a defensive perimeter in the traditional sense. It was a hiding place. The men would form a rough circle, each man facing outward, lying in the undergrowth so completely still that they became part of the landscape. They would eat cold rations, no fires, no lights, no sound. They would sleep in shifts, but even sleep was different for these men. They trained themselves to wake at the slightest unusual noise, a footstep, a cough, the metallic click of a weapon being loaded. In the blackness of the jungle night, where visibility was measured in inches, the Australians relied on their hearing, and their hearing became supernatural. Veterans would later describe being able to identify the difference between a Viet Cong soldier moving through the brush and a wild pig, the difference between rain dripping off leaves and water being poured from a canteen. These were not superhuman abilities. They were the result of constant, unrelenting focus and the knowledge that a single mistake could mean death. But stealth alone does not win battles. The Australians understood that reconnaissance without the ability to act on that intelligence was pointless. So while they perfected the art of being unseen, they simultaneously developed a doctrine of violence that was designed to create maximum psychological impact with minimum exposure. This was the second half of the simple trick, the weapon system that would make the SAS legendary. When an Australian patrol made contact with the enemy, whether through a planned ambush or a chance encounter, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Every weapon in the patrol opened up simultaneously on full automatic. The sound was like tearing sheet metal. The volume of fire was so intense that the enemy invariably believed they were being engaged by a force many times larger than the actual patrol size. This was not spray and pray. This was calculated suppression. The Australians carried more ammunition than any other patrol-sized unit in Vietnam. A standard SAS patrol in 1967 would carry modified L1A1 self-loading rifles, what the British called the SLR, and the Americans knew as the FNFAL. The standard Australian infantry used the SLR in semi-automatic mode, firing 1 round per trigger pull. But the SAS had their weapons illegally modified to fire on full automatic. Some were fitted with forward pistol grips and 30-round magazines instead of the standard 20. These modifications were officially unauthorized, but they were universally adopted because they worked. Combined with an M60 machine gun, an M79 grenade launcher, and often a combat shotgun for the point man, a 4- or 5-man patrol could generate a wall of fire that sounded and felt like a platoon-strength ambush. The tactic was brutally simple, The moment contact was initiated, either by the Australians or by the enemy, every man in the patrol would pour fire into the target area. They did not aim carefully. They did not fire in controlled bursts. They saturated the enemy position with such a high volume of automatic fire that the enemy had two choices: die or run. Most chose to run, and when they ran, they spread stories. Stories about the Australians who fought like devils, stories about patrols that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, stories about men who could kill you without you ever seeing them. Captain A.W. Fremantle, writing about SAS patrol contacts, described the philosophy perfectly. When contact is initiated by the enemy, the immediate retaliation with a heavy volume of automatic fire, even if only in the general direction of the enemy, serves not only to keep his head down, but to create an illusion of a far larger force. It should not be supposed that this firing is entirely indiscriminate or completely uncontrolled, but rather that when contact is initiated by the enemy in close country, one probably will not see anything and will only have a fairly rough idea of where the enemy is. Therefore, it is vital that an immediate heavy volume of suppressive fire is laid down by anybody who can possibly direct his weapon into the general area. This was the opposite of the American approach. American doctrine emphasized aimed fire. Shoot what you can see. Conserve ammunition. Call in artillery and air support to do the heavy lifting. The Australians believed that in the jungle, where visibility was measured in meters and engagements happened at ranges of 10 to 30 meters, the first 3 seconds determined who lived and who died. If you could produce such overwhelming violence in those first 3 seconds that the enemy's will to fight evaporated, you won. You did not need to kill everyone. You needed to break their cohesion. You needed to make them believe that staying in the fight meant certain death. And then, while the enemy was reeling, you disappeared. The Australians did not stick around to count bodies. They did not wait for reinforcements. They broke contact, moved to a pre-planned extraction point, and vanished back into the jungle. By the time the Viet Cong regrouped and realized they had been hit by a handful of men, the Australians were gone. Kilometers away, invisible again. The psychological effect of this tactic was profound. The Viet Cong were used to fighting the South Vietnamese, who often fought from static defensive positions and rarely pursued aggressively. They were used to fighting the Americans, who moved in large formations with heavy support and could be heard coming from a long distance. But the Australians were different. They moved like the Viet Cong moved, silently, patiently, using the jungle as camouflage. But when they struck with a fury that no guerrilla force could match. The Viet Cong began to avoid areas where they suspected Australian patrols were operating. They began to change their routes. They began to move more carefully. They began to fear the jungle itself because they never knew if the Australians were watching. The North Vietnamese Army soldiers, the NVA regulars, were even more shaken. These were professional soldiers. They had faced French paratroopers. They had survived American airstrikes. But they had never encountered an enemy that combined patience and violence so effectively. A former Viet Cong fighter, interviewed years after the war, said it plainly. We were not afraid of the American GIs or the Australian infantry, or even the B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they made comrades disappear. The use of the word disappear is telling. The SAS did not just kill. They killed and then vanished, leaving no trace, creating the impression that the jungle itself had turned against the communists. The statistics tell the story with cold precision, Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted approximately 1,200 patrols in Vietnam. They operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province and into neighboring Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tuy provinces. They killed at least 492 Viet Cong and NVA soldiers, with another 106 listed as possibly killed. They wounded 47 and captured 11. These numbers are confirmed kills only, bodies actually found and counted. The real number is almost certainly higher because the Australians often broke contact before they could conduct a thorough body count, and the Communists were known to drag away their dead and wounded whenever possible. But the truly staggering statistic is the casualty ratio. In 6 years of combat operations, the SAS suffered 1 man killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing in action, and 1 death from illness. Another 28 were wounded in action. This gives a kill ratio of over 15-1 based on confirmed enemy deaths alone. If you factor in the possible kills and the reality that many enemy dead were never counted, the ratio climbs to over 20-1. No other unit in the Vietnam War, American, Australian, South Vietnamese, or Allied, achieved anything close to this. Not the Navy SEALs, not the Army Special Forces, not the long-range reconnaissance patrols. The Australian SAS had cracked the code. They had found the perfect balance between stealth and violence. The first confirmed contact came in May 1966, less than a month after 3 squadron arrived in country. A patrol encountered a Viet Cong force near Nui Dat. It did not go well for the Viet Cong. The Australians unleashed their full firepower, broke contact, and disappeared before the enemy could organize a response. The pattern was set. Over the following months, 3 squadron conducted 134 patrols. They refined their techniques. They learned the terrain. They learned the enemy's patterns. They discovered that the Viet Cong typically moved at certain times. They discovered which trails were used most frequently. They discovered where the bunker complexes were hidden. And they passed this intelligence up the chain, allowing larger Australian and American forces to plan their operations with precision. But the SAS did not just gather intelligence. They acted on it. One of their primary missions was ambush. The Australians would identify a trail that the Viet Cong used regularly. They would set up a killing zone with overlapping fields of fire. They would plant claymore mines to cover the flanks. They would wait for hours, sometimes days, in complete silence. And when the enemy patrol came down the trail, the Australians would initiate the ambush with such ferocity that the enemy would be dead or running before they understood what had happened. These were not large-scale ambushes. Most resulted in 5 to 10 enemy killed. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The Viet Cong began to realize that no trail was safe, no movement was secure. The jungle, which had been their sanctuary, had become a hunting ground. The North Vietnamese understood what was happening. They tried to adapt. They increased security on their patrols. They avoided certain areas. They set up counter-ambushes. But the Australians were always one step ahead. If the Viet Cong avoided the trails, the Australians moved deeper into the jungle. If they increased security, the Australians waited longer, watched more carefully, and struck only when the opportunity was perfect. The Communists could not win this game because the Australians were willing to invest more time, more patience, and more discipline than any other force in Vietnam. The patrols themselves were small, typically 5 men, though sometimes 4 or 6 depending on the mission. Each man had a specific role. The lead scout walked point, moving ahead of the patrol to identify threats and select the route. This was the most dangerous position, requiring nerves of steel and the ability to read the jungle like a book. Behind the scout came the patrol commander, usually a lieutenant or sergeant, who made the tactical decisions. Then the signaller, who carried the radio and maintained communications with base. Then the medic, who carried medical supplies and often a secondary weapon system. Finally, the rear security, who watched the patrol's back trail and ensured they were not being followed. In some configurations, a New Zealand SAS trooper would be attached to the Australian patrol, creating a true Anzac team. These men lived together, trained together, and fought together for their entire tour. The cohesion was extraordinary. They did not need to speak to understand each other. A glance, a hand movement, a subtle shift in posture. The communication was telepathic. This level of trust was essential because in the jungle, when contact happened, there was no time for discussion. Every man had to know exactly what to do, exactly where to move, exactly when to fire. The training to achieve this level of synchronization was brutal. Selection for the SAS was and remains one of the most difficult military selection courses in the world. Only a small percentage of candidates make it through. Those who do are not necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They are the ones who can endure, who can think under pressure, who can adapt, who can function in small teams for extended periods without supervision, who can kill when necessary and show restraint when required. The equipment they carried was carefully chosen and constantly refined. The modified SLRs were the primary weapon. Each man carried between 200 and 300 rounds, far more than a standard infantryman. The M60 machine gunner would carry 500 to 1,000 rounds, depending on the mission. The M79 grenade launcher provided indirect fire capability and could be used to break contact or suppress enemy positions. Some patrols carried combat shotguns, particularly effective in the close-range jungle fighting. All carried claymore mines, fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades for signaling helicopters, and white phosphorus grenades for marking targets or creating instant concealment. They carried minimal food and water because weight was the enemy. A lighter patrol moved faster and quieter. They lived on cold rations, often eating only one meal per day while on patrol. They drank from streams when necessary, accepting the risk of disease as preferable to carrying heavy water supplies. Their uniforms were standard Australian issue but modified based on experience. They wore soft hats instead of helmets because helmets made noise and reduced hearing. They wore their weapons slung in ways that allowed instant access. They carried their grenades on their webbing in positions they could reach in complete darkness. Every piece of equipment had a specific place and a specific purpose. Nothing was extraneous, nothing rattled, nothing reflected light. They were, in the words of one veteran, invisible and lethal. The insertion and extraction procedures were equally refined. Most patrols were inserted by helicopter, typically an Australian or American Huey, but the insertion was never straightforward. The Australians used multiple techniques to confuse the enemy. Sometimes the helicopter would land in multiple locations, dropping off empty or decoy teams before finally inserting the actual patrol. Sometimes they would use a technique called the cowboy insertion, where two helicopters would fly in formation, one landing to drop off a patrol while the other hovered nearby. Both patrols would move out together for 5 to 10 minutes, Then one patrol would circle back to the landing zone and be extracted, leaving the actual patrol to continue the mission. This confused anyone watching and made it impossible for the Viet Cong to know where the Australians actually were. Extraction was even more critical because by the time a patrol was ready to leave, the enemy often knew approximately where they were. The Australians would move to a pre-designated landing zone, secure it, and pop smoke to mark their position for the helicopter. The extraction had to be fast. The Huey would land, the patrol would pile on, and the helicopter would lift off within seconds. In some cases, if the landing zone was too hot or the terrain was too rough, they would use a rope extraction where the helicopter would hover and the men would climb a rope ladder. One Australian soldier died when he fell from a rope extraction, the only SAS man killed in action in the entire war, a testament to both the effectiveness of the tactics and the inherent dangers of the work. But the simple trick, the combination of silence and violence, was not just a tactical advantage. It was a psychological weapon that multiplied the effectiveness of every patrol. The Viet Cong and NVA began to believe that the Australians were everywhere. They believed that the jungle was full of SAS patrols, watching, waiting, ready to strike. In reality, at any given time, there were only a handful of patrols in the field, but the fear was disproportionate to the actual numbers. This is the essence of special operations. You do not need to be everywhere. You just need to make the enemy believe you are everywhere. You do not need to kill everyone. You just need to kill enough people in such a way that the enemy changes their behavior. The Australians achieved this through consistency. Every patrol operated the same way. Silent movement, patient observation, devastating violence, rapid withdrawal. The enemy never knew when or where the next ambush would come, but they knew it would come. And that knowledge changed how they operated. They moved more slowly. They used different routes. They increased security, all of which made them less effective. The SAS was disrupting enemy operations without engaging in large-scale battles. They were winning the war one patrol at a time, the Americans noticed. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRRPS, began to adopt Australian techniques. American commanders requested that Australian SAS personnel serve as instructors at the Mai CV Recondo School at Nha Trang, where they taught reconnaissance and commando skills to American and South Vietnamese soldiers. The techniques spread. The concept of moving slowly and striking hard became a standard part of the Special Operations playbook. But the Australians remained the masters. They had the experience. They had the discipline. They had the patience that comes from a culture that values understatement and effectiveness over flash and drama. The missions evolved over time. In the early years, the focus was on reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. By 1968 and 1969, as the Australian Task Force expanded its area of operations, the SAS was conducting more offensive missions. They would identify enemy bunker complexes and direct airstrikes or artillery onto them. They would ambush supply routes. They would hunt high-value targets, enemy commanders, and political officers whose deaths disrupted the communist command structure. These were not random killings. These were precision strikes designed to degrade enemy capability and morale. And they worked. The North Vietnamese attempted to counter the SAS with their own special forces. They deployed trackers. They deployed counter-reconnaissance teams. They tried to ambush the Australians, but they were never as successful. The Australians had one critical advantage. They were operating from a secure base with reliable air support, steady resupply, and modern equipment. The Viet Cong and NVA were operating from hidden bases across the border in Cambodia or deep in the jungle, constantly moving to avoid detection, often short on food and ammunition. The Australians could afford to be patient. The enemy could not. By 1969, the Viet Cong presence in Phuoc Tuy Province had been significantly degraded. This was not due solely to the SAS. The entire Australian task force contributed, but the SAS played a disproportionate role. They provided the eyes and ears that allowed the infantry battalions to operate effectively. They disrupted enemy operations before they could threaten Australian bases. They created a climate of fear that made the jungle an unsafe place for the Communists. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, where a single Australian company fought off a regimental-sized enemy force, was won in part because of SAS intelligence that had been tracking enemy movements in the days before the battle. The SAS did not fire a shot in that engagement, but their contribution was critical. As the war progressed, the enemy adapted. By 1970, after 5 years of continuous SAS operations, the Viet Cong had become familiar with Australian insertion techniques. They began to fire on helicopters shortly after they landed, hoping to catch the patrol before it could disappear into the jungle. The Australians adapted in turn, developing new insertion methods, varying their procedures, and increasing the complexity of their operations. The cat-and-mouse game continued, but the Australians maintained the upper hand. The kill ratio remained heavily in their favor. The fear remained real. The final SAS squadron withdrew from Vietnam in February 1971 as part of the overall Australian drawdown. By that time, they had established a legacy that would define Australian special operations for decades. They had proven that small, highly trained units could achieve strategic effects through tactical excellence. They had demonstrated that patience and discipline were force multipliers as important as firepower. They had shown that the simple trick of moving like ghosts and fighting like demons was more effective than any amount of advanced technology or overwhelming numbers. The lessons learned in Vietnam shaped the future of the SAS. After the war, the regiment took the lead in developing Australia's counter-terrorism capability, forming the Tactical Assault Group in 1979. They trained for hostage rescue, for urban operations, for desert warfare, for mountain warfare, for every environment and mission type imaginable. But the core principles remained the same. Move silently, strike violently, disappear completely, trust your patrol, master your craft. These were not new ideas, but the Australians had perfected them in the jungles of Vietnam. The Viet Cong never forgot the phantoms who haunted their trails. In interviews conducted after the war, former communist fighters spoke with a mixture of respect and residual fear about the Australians. They described the terror of knowing that an SAS patrol might be watching at any moment. They described the frustration of searching for an enemy that left no trace. They described the shock of being hit by what sounded like a company, but turned out to be 4 or 5 men who vanished before reinforcements could arrive. These were psychological scars that lasted longer than the physical wounds. For the Australians who served, the experience was formative. Many went on to long careers in the military or law enforcement. They carried the lessons learned in Vietnam into peacekeeping operations in East Timor, into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, into training roles where they passed on their knowledge to the next generation. They spoke little about what they did. This was partly operational security. Special operations thrive on secrecy. But it was also cultural. Australians do not brag, they understate, they let their actions speak, and the actions of the SAS in Vietnam spoke volumes. The simple trick was never really simple. It required years of training. It required physical and mental toughness that most people cannot imagine. It required the ability to function in extreme discomfort for extended periods. It required the willingness to kill and the judgment to know when not to. It required trust in your patrol mates that went beyond ordinary friendship. These men ate together, slept together, fought together, and depended on each other for survival in an environment designed to kill them. The bonds formed in those jungles were unbreakable, but at its core the trick was conceptually simple. Be quieter than the enemy. See the enemy before he sees you. When you strike, strike so hard that he believes he is fighting a force 10 times your size. Then disappear before he can respond. Repeat this pattern until the enemy fears the jungle more than he fears your conventional forces. Use that fear to shape his behavior. Make him avoid certain areas. Make him move more slowly. Make him use more resources on security. Degrade his effectiveness without engaging in pitched battles. This is the essence of special operations. This is what the Australian SAS mastered in Vietnam. The statistics remain staggering even today. Over 500 confirmed enemy killed with less than 10 friendly fatalities across 6 years of continuous combat operations. A kill ratio that has never been matched by any comparable unit in any modern conflict. These numbers are not the result of superior technology. The Australians used the same weapons as everyone else. They did not have better helicopters or better radios. What they had was better training, better discipline, and a tactical doctrine that leveraged their strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. The jungle itself was part of the weapon system. The Australians understood that the jungle was neutral. It did not favor the communists just because they had been fighting there longer. It favored whoever used it more intelligently. The Viet Cong used the jungle as concealment and as a sanctuary. The Australians used it as a weapon. They turned the enemy's own terrain against him. They made the jungle into a place where being Vietnamese and knowing the local area did not matter if you could not hear the Australians moving behind you. They made noise discipline so absolute that they could walk past enemy positions without being detected. They made their movements so unpredictable that the enemy could never establish a pattern. The enemy tried everything. They laid ambushes on likely patrol routes. They set up observation posts. They tried to follow the Australians back to their landing zones. Nothing worked consistently. The Australians were too good. They varied their routes. They changed their procedures. They used the terrain that no one else would use because it was too difficult. They accepted discomfort as the price of surprise. They understood that if you are willing to endure more than your enemy, you have an advantage that cannot be taken away. This philosophy extended to every aspect of their operations. Water discipline. A man can go days without food, but only hours without water in the Vietnamese heat. Most units carried heavy loads of water. The Australians carried minimal water and drank from streams, accepting the risk of disease because a lighter, faster patrol had tactical advantages that outweighed medical risks. Noise discipline. They trained until every action was silent. They knew which pieces of equipment made which sounds and how to eliminate those sounds. They knew how to move through bamboo without snapping it. They knew how to step on ground that would not crackle or squelch. These were not natural abilities. These were skills developed through thousands of hours of practice. Fire discipline. When the shooting started, the Australians fired everything, but when it stopped, they stopped. They did not waste ammunition. They did not fire at shadows. They fired when they had targets or when they needed to create the illusion of a larger force. Every burst was purposeful. Every magazine was accounted for. They knew exactly how much ammunition they had at all times because running out in the middle of an engagement meant death. This level of awareness, this constant mental accounting of resources and options, is what separates special operations from conventional warfare. It is not just about being brave. It is about being smart under pressure. The patrol reports from the period, the ones that have been declassified, read like technical manuals written by ghosts. Dry descriptions of positions, movements, contacts, and withdrawals. No drama, no emotion, just facts. But between the lines, you can read the incredible discipline. Patrol inserted at grid coordinates. Moved 300 meters west-northwest over 4 hours. Established observation post overlooking trail. Observed enemy movement at 14:30 hours. Counted 12 individuals moving south. No contact initiated. Extracted at 1700 hours. This kind of patience, watching the enemy walk by, and not engaging because the mission was reconnaissance, not combat, requires a level of fire control that most soldiers never achieve. And when contact was initiated, the reports are equally clinical. Engaged enemy patrol of 7 individuals at range of 20 meters. Expended 180 rounds, 5.56, 80 rounds, 7.62, 440 millimeter grenades. Enemy suffered, estimated 5 killed in action, 2 fled north. Own casualties nil, broke contact, and moved to extraction point. These reports do not capture the chaos, the noise, the smell of cordite, the screams, the adrenaline. They do not capture the 11 seconds of absolute violence followed by the silent withdrawal through the jungle. But they tell you everything you need to know about the effectiveness of the tactic. Short engagement. High enemy casualties, no friendly casualties. Mission accomplished. The North Vietnamese commanders understood that they had a problem. The Australian SAS was disrupting their operations in Phuoc Tuy Province to a degree that was strategically significant. They issued orders to avoid Australian patrols. They offered bounties for SAS soldiers killed or captured. They deployed their best trackers and most experienced fighters. But they could not solve the problem because the Australians were not fighting conventionally. You cannot defeat an enemy you cannot find. You cannot ambush an enemy that never uses the same route twice. You cannot track an enemy that moves so slowly and carefully that he leaves no trace. The Communists were trying to fight a conventional guerrilla war. The Australians were fighting something else entirely, a war of shadows and sudden death. This is the ultimate irony. The Viet Cong and NVA were supposed to be the masters of guerrilla warfare. They were the ones who had defeated the French through patience and attrition. They were the ones who were frustrating American forces with hit-and-run tactics. But when they encountered the Australians, they found themselves on the receiving end of the same tactics, executed with a precision and discipline they could not match. The hunters became the hunted. The ghosts became the haunted. And for 6 years, every communist soldier operating in Phuoc Tuy Province had to live with the knowledge that an Australian patrol might be watching him at any moment. The simple trick was never about one specific technique. It was a philosophy, a way of thinking about warfare that prioritized intelligence over brute force, patience over speed, precision over volume. The Australians understood that in a guerrilla war, you do not win by killing everyone. You win by making the enemy so paranoid, so cautious, so afraid that they cannot operate effectively. You win by being the nightmare that lives in the jungle. You win by being the story that gets told around the campfire, the unit that everyone fears, the patrol that no one sees coming. And if you can achieve that with 4 or 5 men instead of a company or a battalion, you have just multiplied your combat power by a factor of 10 or 20. This is what the Australian SAS achieved in Vietnam. They did not win the war. No single unit could have won that war. But they won their piece of it. They made Phuoc Tuy Province safer for Australian forces than any other province in South Vietnam. They created a bubble of relative security around Nui Dat that allowed the Australian task force to operate with a freedom of movement that most American units envied. They did this not through massive firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through the simple trick of moving like ghosts and striking like gods, through silence and violence, through patience and precision, through the absolute mastery of their craft. The jungle that once belonged to the Viet Cong became a place where even the most experienced communist fighters walked in fear. The trails that had been safe for years became kill boxes where death could arrive without warning. The sanctuary became a hunting ground, and the hunters were 5 quiet men from Australia who had learned their trade in the jungles of Borneo and Malaya and had come to Vietnam to prove that the simple trick, the oldest trick in the book, still worked. Be quieter than the enemy. See him first. Hit him hard. Disappear completely. It is simple, but simple is not easy, and the men of the Australian SAS made it look easy for 6 years, until the jungle itself seemed to whisper their legend.